Shabbat Shalom, Rai. Good to see everyone. Welcome to Sabbath Collective, a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of the Bible. We are actually in a series now about Esther, and we're on the second part of that series. And there are really some enigmas when they come to Esther. So we started with the meaning of the names. In Persian, Esther means star. Which to this time and place was something that leads, that influences actually. And then the root of her word, of her name, was even more interesting. It actually comes from the Hebrew word Esther, and it means hidden, which is very interesting. It means to conceal or hide. And then her additional name is Hadassah, which means myrtle. So we have this concept of a star, which leads and which guides. We have her other name, Esther, which means to conceal or hidden, like you can't see all of it. And then there is Hadassah, and Hadassah is the myrtle tree. Now, if you remember, in the Sukkot, there were 4 species used in the Sukkot to celebrate for worship. And each species actually represented a different way to serve the Lord. And the myrtle means to see. So there's really some seemingly contrasting images of concealment and shining, which leads and influences sight. And then, of course, there was the name of Jehovah, which, by the way, we cannot see in the text at all. Now, this is very unusual when you think of it. The name of God is not in the book. So there's a suggestion of an acrostic that spells out his name, but we don't actually find his name overtly. It's very unusual because he is unseen in a book of the Tanakh. So connected to that unseen God, then there's the name of the holiday of Purim. And Purim is the celebration of this story. And Purim means to cast lots, as in casting them like we would sort of flip a coin for a decision to determine the will of the gods. So the Purim holiday is named after lots because it's what Haman threw to determine the day that the Jews would be annihilated. And casting lots, depending on how you relate to this act, is either chance or it's providence. As we read of the followers of the Lord also use lots to determine God's will. So we have this tension, this contrast in the book. Is it providence or chance in a book that does not have the name of the Lord? Again, these enigmas, Esther enigmas, when it comes to this book. So we're going to pick up where we were last week. And actually now Mother Esther is Mother Persia, or the queen. And her cousin, the man who raised her, Mordecai, has been put into a position of government as well. And he sort of sits at the king's gate. So now we have an antagonist that enters into the story. His name is Haman. And he has been risen to a position of power, the viceroy, and he's right underneath of the king. So this is a man who really has some power here, and he's second to the king. So let's look at Esther. By the way, are you loving that we can now read the text together, which is really cool. So we're going to look at Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And we're going to kind of take a look at what that looks like. Sometime later, King Ahasuerus began to single out Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, for advancement. And eventually he gave him precedence over all his fellow officers. All the king's servants at the king's gate would kneel and bow down before Haman because the king had so ordered. But Mordecai would neither kneel nor bow down to him. The king's servants at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why don't you obey the king's order?" But after they had confronted him a number of times without his paying attention to them, they told Haman in order to find out whether Mordecai's explanation that he was a Jew would suffice to justify his behavior. Haman was furious when he saw that Mordecai was not kneeling and bowing down to him. However, on learning what people Mordecai belonged to, it seemed to him a waste to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Rather, he decided to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole of Ahasuerus' kingdom. So this was a very intense thing that was happening here. It was, if you will, a face-off. And that face-off would be between two people that were both very serious with what they were doing. It was a very intense, deep thing. So let's do a deep dive here. First with the backstory of Haman. Haman is an Agagite. And maybe you've heard of Agagites before, I don't know. But Agagites, when you trace this ancestry, you'll discover that an Agagite is an Amalekite, the people group that were descendants of Esau. Now, King Saul had been instructed to eliminate these people as they were enemies of Israel. But in his own reasoning, he chose to spare Agag, the king of the Amalekites. So there's all kinds of opinions of why he let the king live. But here's the deal. Saul disobeyed the Lord, and he left this lineage going. And throughout Scripture, this tribe of Amalekites represents the enemies of the Israelites and the strategies to wipe out the Jewish people. So Haman exists because of Saul not completing what he was supposed to do. That's really interesting. I wonder how many of us were supposed to deal with something, and because we didn't, it still comes up to bite us, right? And Esther and Mordecai were actually descendants of Saul. So again, applying this to our own lives, this is something very important that we see. We may be put it in check, something that's wrong in our life, but for some reason, not a healthy one, we leave it around. Why? Haman exists because the root was not removed. So let's look at the face-off here. Haman is in a position of power, and everyone who bows down to Haman, but Mordecai refuses. Why did Mordecai refuse to bow? And here's what you may have heard. Oh, it's actually sinful for Jewish people to bow down. But actually, that is not the case at all. It's not sinful. In fact, if you think of scriptures, we can think of Natan and Yaakov and Yosef bowing down to the brothers. They also bowed down. So why didn't he bow? The Hebrew phrasing about the order to bow that our versions say is the king so ordered. It's actually the king ordered Haman, suggesting Haman and the king in a conversation alone. So here's what we can kind of deduce. We know that Haman was really being a manipulative person. And Haman and the king have this conversation and they're alone. And it was in this conversation alone that the king tells Haman, oh yeah, have people bow down to you. So you have this arrogant, prideful power grabber who wants to be honored. And the Midrash says that Haman wore an idol around his neck. And that's why Mordecai wouldn't bow. Maybe that's the truth. But did it actually have to be a real, actual idol for Mordecai to feel that this bowing was not godly? The origins of idolatry was that people thought of God as abstract. So they would honor and bow to people they thought were his servants or to figures of the gods. So thinking that would get them favor from God. So whether it's a physical idol on his neck or the pride that lifts himself up as the second to the god Ahasuerus, this was most likely perceived as idolatry by Mordecai. It probably felt more like worshiping the person himself as he lifted himself up, as opposed to just a sign of Eastern respect. And Mordecai does not bow. Despite the other people in the court asking him day after day, why don't you bow? Why don't you bow? Why don't you bow? Which, by the way, the only other time this exact phrase in Hebrew about someone being badgered day after day to do something they didn't want to do is found in one other place. And it's with Joseph, and Potiphar's wife. The same phrase. She badgered him day after day after day. Mordecai and Joseph are actually both sons of Rachel. And both of them refused to submit to power when it was trying to get them to compromise their own value system and morality. So Haman wants to kill Mordecai. And then he immediately goes from one man to the whole people group. All the Jews now he wants to kill, of which there were millions in this kingdom. So he wants to annihilate them all. And by the way, if you missed the first teaching from last week, I encourage you to go to the page and catch up. So we need to understand that sometimes there is an irrational hatred towards people who do good. And I want you to hear me say that. Sometimes there is an irrational hatred towards people who do good. Normally, when we experience a person who seems to really be obsessed with working against us, we'll say, oh, I'm probably being too sensitive. It's probably not personal. And it's good to put yourself in check that way. However, sometimes it's not paranoia to think people can have an evil obsession with destroying you. And when that happens, when we have an enemy that's coming after us in that obsessive kind of way, the enemy usually feels very big and very powerful. And you usually feel very small and very unpowerful. So let me ask you this question. Have you ever had an enemy like that? And if you did have an enemy like that, how did you figure out how to stand up to him? How were you able to stand up to him? It's an interesting thing about enemies that come after us. What we oftentimes think is that, well, we have no power at all and the enemy has all the power. And so therefore we literally give them our power. And they don't even take it from us. We give them our power. So James Baldwin has a really great thing that he's written here. I imagine, he says, one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with the pain. Take a look at that, because now you can read that, which is pretty cool. That's an amazing thing to think about. That people are obsessed with their pain, and that's why they hold on to their hate. And that is a very real issue in our life. I'm sorry, this computer is kind of bugging out now, so I'm going to have to go on my phone so that I can actually see your comments here. And, you know, it's like what happens when you go from a Mac to a PC. It's a little bit of a learning curve, I think. So I'm going to go on Facebook now and look it up on my phone, and I'm going to see your comments if you comment at all. So again, this is a kind of obsession that is very real, and it is very scary. And so this is what Haman is doing to Esther and to Mordecai. And it is a very scary thing. So when people are trying to cover up their pain, that is when their obsession with destroying others can be the absolute fiercest. It's literally all consuming. And that is a very scary thing for us to have to deal with. We don't know how to overcome that when all that we're thinking about is the fact that this enemy is coming after us. So after casting some lots, what happens is Haman decides that it's the right time to go after the king. And so he says, now I'm going to go to the king and I'm going to talk him in to doing this horrible holocaust to the Jewish people. And that is what my plan is. So Esther 3, 8 through 10 says, Then Haman said to Ahasuerus, there is a particular people scattered and dispersed among the people in all of the provinces of your kingdom, and they cannot be destroyed. So when people are scattered throughout, it's very hard to control them, right? They wouldn't assimilate. The people would not assimilate. They are a paradox. There's no centralized head, in other words. There's no specific leader. They're a group of people scattered all over the nation, joined only by a common vision. It's kind of sounds like another group that we know, right? Black Lives Matter. And we know why it makes people nervous. It makes people nervous because they can't take out the head. There is no head. They can't blow up the office because there isn't an office. So these Jewish people were all over, and as we discussed last week, this is a huge geographical area. And keeping control was of utmost priority to the king. Their laws are different from those of other people. If there's a religious code there that is different from everyone else. So the next thing that we see is that they are openly different. Paranoid power will oftentimes accept different beliefs and practices if they are done in private. In other words, not around us. We don't want to see different. Different makes us nervous. Keep different people in the closet. John F. Kennedy said, conformity is the jailer of freedom and the enemy of growth. They are openly different people and they don't care about fitting in. And so because of that, they become suspect. Haman goes on with the king and he says, moreover, they don't observe the king's laws. In other words, they are lawbreakers. And again, we see this today with xenophobia, right? So when people don't feel comfortable about people that they may think are different than them and are coming into this country, they label them rapists and drug dealers. And on top of that, young survivors of gun violence in their school that are actually standing up and using their voices are being marginalized by labels specifically spoken about them to divide. I just had a conversation about the same exact thing happening in my youth when hippies were labeled dirty. Everybody called hippies dirty. So people who want to control through power are obsessed with the lawbreakers. That they perceive in some way that the people that are different than them will threaten their way of life because they are lawbreakers. And keep in mind this, and this is something very interesting, that actually lawbreakers oftentimes have a stricter code of moral laws than the people that are obsessed with them do. It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have, James Baldwin says. Look at this again. It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. Now, I'm sorry I'm not able to pick up your comments tonight, but I'm going to read them afterwards and kind of comment back. But this is a very real issue. And we have it today. We have it 2,000 years ago. We have it 200 years ago. It is certain in any case that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have. So these are the three fears that Haman, this person who was ticked off at Mordecai because Mordecai would not bow down to him. And he felt threatened, and his authority felt threatened. And so he went to the king and he said, look, I want to take out this guy, and I want to wipe out all of the Jews, and there are millions of them. And here's the three reasons why I think we should do that. Because they cannot be controlled, because they are different, and because they are lawbreakers. It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? He goes on and says, it doesn't befit the king to tolerate them. And again, he's appealing to what we talked about last week, which was that the king really had a concern about being able to control this giant geographical area. And so control was a big thing for King Ahasuerus. And Haman knows this. And he says, it's beneath you, the king, to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, have a decree written for their destruction, and I will hand over 330 tons of silver to the officials in charge of the king's affairs to deposit in the royal treasury. So the king, the text says, took a signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, and who is the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you, and the people too. Do with as seems good to you. So the person in power gets something, a payoff. It is his position, King Ahasuerus, of feeling kingly and having people see him that way. People in power are easily manipulated through greed for more power. And Haman knows exactly what buttons to push, and that makes them a very dangerous duo. So we'll get into this relationship when we continue with this series, but the two of these together are fierce. And the king has all the power, and Haman has the ear of the king. And Mordecai, a Jew, has made an enemy of him. This is a very real situation. Verse 15 says, at the king's order, the runners went out quickly, and the decree was issued in Shushan, the capital. Then the king and Haman sat down for a drink together, but the city of Shushan was thrown into confusion. Listen to this again. It says that the king and Haman sat down for a drink together, but the city of Shushan was thrown into confusion. So imagine this decree goes out that all of the Jewish people are going to be killed. And now the king and Haman sit down and have a drink together while the whole city was in chaos. There's a total detachment of the pain that will happen, and it is happening to the people. And this is what happens when we have this kind of leadership that is only about this sort of corruption and power. When it moves on others who are not part of the system, there is a sort of dehumanization there. And again, we've seen this 4,000 years ago. We've seen this 2,000 years ago. We've seen this 200 years ago. We see this today. It doesn't change. An interesting quote that I read about this concept of how people dehumanize people that they can't control and that won't assimilate and that they perceive as lawbreakers is by Andrew Jackson, referring to Native Americans. And he wanted to move them out of their lands. And here's what he said: build a fire under them, and when it gets hot enough, they'll move. And why did he say that about the Native Americans? They can't be controlled. They're different. They're lawbreakers. Oh, and we want their lands. In 1838, 16,000 Native Americans were marched over 1,200 miles of rugged land to be relocated. Over 4,000 of them died of disease, famine, and violence. It was this terrible, awful, inhumane atrocities. And the tribe was actually called the Cherokee, which means those of a different speech. Again, things don't change, do they? those of a different speech. And this event is called the Trail of Tears. If you've never read about it, you really need to. It's part of our history. Sioux Chief Sitting Bull said the love of possession is a disease with them. They take tithes from the poor and weak to support the rich who rule. They claim this mother of ours, the earth, for their own fence, and they fence their neighbors away. This is what power does to people they consider the others. And again, we still see it today. But we're reading a story about a heroine, about a young woman who would not stand for it. So Psalm 37:12 says, the wicked plots against the righteous and grinds his teeth at him. Now, this is a really intense verse, right? And again, sometimes there's an irrational hatred that evil has against people that are doing good in the world. And that irrational hatred is a force. This word for plots means scheme, and it is to lie in wait. And the picture of grinding your teeth is a symbol for rage. So this is an evil obsession that strategizes and wants to destroy. Mordecai is in a terrible place here, and soon Esther will be too. And there will be a choice that must be made that will affect a people, millions of them. So next week is Passover, and we're going to be doing that, talking through that. And I encourage you to get your Passover elements because we're going to be doing that together. And then the week after that, Andre's actually going to be teaching us, which is going to be great, on Sabbath Collective. And then on April 18th, we're going to continue with this series. We're going to conclude this series on Esther. And we're going to see what this young heroine stands up and does for justice. We're going to close this time with the lighting of the Shabbos candles. And traditionally, the mother of the home lights the candles. And the candles connect us to the Sabbath light of peace and joy and unity. And then there's a tradition that she encircles the candles with her hands 3 times. And that's a symbol of welcoming in the Sabbath. And then she prays as she covers her eyes from the flame as a symbol of ending all work. Blessed are you, Yahweh our God, King of the universe, who has set us apart by his commandments, who has given us Yeshua the Messiah, and has sent us to be a light to the world. The Lord is our light and our salvation. May his light be felt in this space as the enlightenment of truth and the radiance of joy. Amen. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. If you want to comment, I'll read all the comments after we post. Love you all. God bless.